Performance Mindset. I'm Megan Devito, a performance mindset coach, a swim coach, and somebody who believes your mental game drives everything. Today's guest decided he was going to be a coach at age 14, much to his parents' horror. They heard coach and they pictured some guy in gym shorts yelling at kids. And what Chris DeSantis actually became is something entirely different. A mental performance coach with a master's in applied psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. The program was founded by Martin Seligman himself. Over 15 plus years, Chris has coached athletes at the D1 level at UPenn, Georgia Tech, and led programs for the Danish national team. And now he runs his own coaching and consulting practice where he trains athletes, coaches, and teams to do something that most people don't believe is possible, to think differently on purpose. In this conversation, we get into why positive psychology isn't fluff, it's actually cognitive training. We talk about why the phrase head case needs to die and how fear-based motivation actually trains pessimism, and what happens when you realize that optimism, kindness, and mental toughness are all skills that you can build, not personality traits that you're stuck with. Chris is the host of the Swim Breathe podcast and the founder of Chris DeSantis Coaching. Whether you're an athlete stuck in your own head during competition, or a coach navigating the loneliness of leadership, or an executive who needs to perform under pressure, this conversation is one of my favorites and just what you've been looking for. Let's get to it. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Peak Performance Mindset. I am really excited to be able to introduce you to Chris DeSantis. Chris is a coach and a consultant. He has got some great stories for you today, great wisdom to share with you. And in full disclosure, we just recorded for his podcast. So you're going to want to make sure that you go back and you listen to that episode because there's a lot of good stuff in there. So Chris, thank you so much for jumping on here today with me.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah.
So well, tell everybody a little bit about what you do so we can, kind of understand where we're coming from in this episode.
Yeah. I call myself a coach consultant because I work in a few different areas. So first off, I do individualized coaching. I coach athletes. I work in business settings as well. And actually, my primary area of coaching is I actually coach other coaches. So I do one-to-one coaching with other coaches, a lot of them in the sport of swimming. I came up in the sport of swimming. I also, part of my background is I have a master's in applied positive psychology. And so I have a whole curriculum around that I go around and teach. And so I work with like teams and athletic departments, even trying to take some of that sort of applied knowledge from the positive psychology world out into those settings. And that's probably like more sort of the consultant side of what I'm doing.
It's good work.
I know, right?
Yeah, that's great work. I love that we're on the same page with that. And my hope is that the more that people like you and I talk about how important this is, the more that other people will be like, oh, you know what? They're onto something. Because I think for a long time, there was a lot of, wait, so just like positive thinking. I'm like, it's not like that. I'm not telling you to believe things you don't believe.
Yeah.
So, but to that point, like, what is it how did you get into coaching? Like, yes, coaching swim, but I think that people assume in my experience, if I tell people I'm a coach, they're like, oh, what sport? And I'm like, well, yes, but how did you know coaching was your jam? What was that like?
Yeah, so much to my parents' chagrin, I decided I was going to be a coach at age 14. My dad definitely came from like a old school New England blue blood family where everybody was lawyers and doctors and went to Ivy League schools. And so I think that was the plan he had for me. So he was horrified on that level. My mom, I think just vaguely was like, well, he's going to be highly educated and coaching, first of all, that's like guys in gym shorts that run around next to kids and yell at them. Like that's such a undignified profession. I mean, they were truly horrified. But to be honest with you, I was in the 8th grade. I had been swimming for 5 years. It was really the only sport I'd ever stuck with. I can't say that actually up to that point, I'd really enjoyed it that much, but I found that it was a sport that if you put yourself into it, like you got something back out. I got very hooked into the part where, if you put a little bit of work in, like you will see that improvement. The clock goes down, all that stuff comes. And I had changed teams and I got a new coach and I fell in love. I mean, with this coach, like I was so excited to come to practice. And not only did it have a big impact on me in terms of like how I was doing sports wise, but it had a knock on impact to like the rest of my life. I was getting better grades. I was doing better socially in school. I got my first girlfriend. Like, all of a sudden all the doors were open. And I thought like how amazing that somebody could have this impact on you. Like, I want to do that. Mm-hmm. That sounds like the coolest thing that I could possibly do. And from that point forward, I was all the way hooked into it.
Oh, your first coaching gig, where was it? What'd you do? Like big kids, little kids, all the kids?
So it's hard to say what the first one is. This is, if I go post college, right? If I go right. I did a little bit of summer league coaching and other stuff. And like I've told this story in other contexts, but even all the way down to like when I was a high school swimmer, I've had my high school swim coach on my podcast. So if people want to go back and listen, you can hear her talk about this. I was like coaching other guys on the team. I was making lineups for dual meets. I was scouting other teams. So like I was into that stuff. I'm preparing for, my career from that point forward. Actually in college, I interned with a swim club. So I was doing, swim lessons, learn to swim, coaching an age group. Mm-hmm. And then post college, I went to work at an all boys boarding school in Western Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Yeah. And somehow amazingly, I met my wife that year, not in Western Pennsylvania when I was home. Right. Thank God. But I moved from there into college coaching. I managed to hook on more or less as a volunteer coach at the University of Pennsylvania. And from there, went to go coach at Georgia Tech. I was an assistant coach at Georgia Tech for 4 years. From there, I went to coach abroad. I'm a dual citizen of the United States and Denmark. I coached in Denmark for 4 years. I got fired from my job in Denmark and quite traumatically. And we returned to the United States and my mom was sick. My mom had a brain tumor. She was dying. It was a really, really bad time in my life. And so I did what any sane person would do is, start a business because that's not stressful or tough on your mental health.
Right.
So I went into business for myself coaching, but I had always had the sense of that was something that I could do. And that, one of my frustrations, I mentioned my background in positive psychology earlier, is that I had this big tool set. But when in a lot of environments, particularly the higher end environments that I was coaching on, I felt like there was so little time to implement some of the stuff that I wanted to do. Like I knew I could make a real difference if I sat down with somebody that I was coaching for an hour a week. Okay. But I was coaching 20 people and there's practice time too. There wasn't 20 hours a week to, do an individual session and move all these people forward. So I had a sense that, going independent, I could make a different impact than I could in some of these team settings. And I decided to find out like if that was truly true, right? If that was actually possible.
Yeah. And I love that you brought that up and that you said how much your coach impacted you. And it sounds like the culture on your first team was incredible. I mean, I really feel like there's a tone that has to be set. And whether it's, yes, technique, yes, all those, stats and entries and all those things are important. But when push comes to shove, if a team doesn't have solid culture, it's a mess. The swimmers are fighting. There's just the dynamic isn't there. So if you look at what it is that you bring with your consulting and your coaching, like whether you're working with a team or you're working one-on-one, what is that like? And like, what is it, the foundation that maybe you took from what did you learn about how to develop that to have athletes or business owners or whoever like trust you with that? It sounds like a culture thing is what I'm saying, I guess.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of aspects. If I think back to specifically that team that hooked me in when I was a kid, first off, again, I think it speaks to the value that a coach has. We look at like a lot of different situations and you go, well, like that team, they work with people on a really high technical level, or they're the hardest working team, or at the end of the day, I think a lot of kids, the relationship that they have with their coach is everything in terms of whether or not they hook into the sport and choose to, try to develop how they work on a technical level, or choose to like really push the limits of how hard they work. So the foundation for me with everything, and a lot of the work that I do now in coaching coaches and education, is a lot around how do we get to a point where your relationships on the team are strong enough such that, like, every coach I know has so much knowledge that they could use to make an athlete on their team better, but they get very little of it through, right? And to me, the relationship is that kind of focus point that determines how much you're actually able to teach and transmit to the athlete. So the relationship piece is a big part of it. Another thing that I reflect on, and I think, like, as a coach, if you're not learning from the people that you're coaching, even about your own process, you're missing out. And so I'll share an insight that an athlete actually gave me that I've carried with and like realized, oh, that's my thing. That's part of what I do. I was coaching at Georgia Tech, and I had a really, really diverse group of swimmers. I think we had about 20 athletes in the water, 7 different countries, and people bringing all sorts of different kind of approaches. Like, everybody was hardworking, but they were hardworking in different ways, right? I had one guy who was like Mr. Consistent. I had one guy who literally had like no limiter. He would just go for it, right? And 10 reps in, he could barely move. And the two of them, the reason I bring this up is because the two of them didn't necessarily, like, sometimes if I didn't do my job coaching wise, they could look at each other and go, that guy's stupid. He's doing it wrong. Right. Instead of respecting that, like, that guy's working really hard. I'm working really hard in this other way to do it. But I actually asked the group of athletes that I was coaching, I said, hey, I got a new batch coming in. What do they need to know about what it's like to have me as a coach? And this guy, and you talk about relationships, the guy who answered this question, the last time I watched him swim a lap was 2013. And we have a relationship to this day. Like, I
love that.
So he says to everybody else, he says, your head's going to hurt at every practice because you're going to have to think a lot. Chris is going to ask you to think. And then when you think you've thought it all the way through, he's going to ask you to think it through again and again and again and again. And I thought about it for a second. I go, yeah, that's right. Because at the end of the day, a lot of what I end up doing is I'm trying to train people through cognitive processes. I'm trying to get them to think differently, because it's that process of thinking differently that unlocks everything else, right? The way that you can actually start to show up in a different way, to realize different parts of your potential or take on new knowledge. It has everything to do with what is my thought process approaching those moments. And so I push people really, really hard on that piece.
Love that. And I think it's the hardest thing for us to be aware of is our thinking. We take it as like the news ticker at the bottom of a screen, right? Like, it's rolling and we just like, wow, that's happening and that's happening and that's happening. And we just believe it because it's there without questioning it. But that idea of pausing to say, what am I actually thinking about right now? And when I think that, how do I behave? Or am I not thinking about anything? Am I just like driving my way through this process, whether it's swimming or anything else, am I just on autopilot? Have I thought about anything today? But slowing down enough to think about what you're thinking is just a next level sort of thought process. I was talking with someone, a guy who he works for a business down in Louisiana, and I was talking with him the other day, and I said, we really need you. I need you to start being very aware about the story that you're telling about yourself at this job. Like, this is what you're saying to me. And if it's coming out of your mouth, it's going through your mind. So I need you to be aware. And he goes, how do I do that? I go, you have to think about what you're thinking. And I said, the easiest way for you to do that is you're going to need to write it down. I mean, you might even just really have to say, what did I just say? What did I just say? But to have the consciousness maybe to say, wait a second, hold on a second. I need to pause and rewind my brain. What did I say? Why would I say that? And I guess for a general rule of thumb, I'm like, if you wouldn't say it to your grandmother and you wouldn't say it to your mom and you wouldn't say it to your kid, you're not allowed to say it to yourself. And we can get so wrapped up in this running narrative of garbage that's just not true. Like, what are you thinking about? Are you actually thinking about what you're changing and what you want? Or are you just thinking about everything you don't want? It's a tough thing to do.
Yeah. And I think you're pointing to something like probably the number one thing that I think is really universal with people that I work with is they are coaching themselves. Everybody coaches themselves to a certain degree. For the most part, to ourselves, we are the worst coach you could possibly imagine. I mean, I have very simply like put people through the exercise of, getting them to externalize, as you said, like, let's write down all the like stuff that you're directing at yourself right now. And I say, I want you to just imagine your boss saying this, or like, with like a lot of teen athletes, I'll be like, I want you to imagine your coach saying this to you. Instead of you saying it to you, coach is now standing up on the pool deck and yelling this at you. So how much longer would you be on that team? I mean, most of them, they're like, I'd quit tomorrow. It's ridiculous. They can't talk to me like that, right? But that's what they're doing to themselves. And I mean, I recognize it because I am that person as well.
I think we all are at some point, right? Like, we're like, wow, whoa, that was awful.
Yeah. Unchecked. That's who I am as well, right? I can be absolutely awful to myself. Doesn't mean I'm a negative person, just means I'm actually like a person. That's how people are to themselves. And unless they build some skills for thinking differently and get some strategies around challenging that, they will stick with that as a strategy, double down. I mean, I've worked with so many athletes that just think like, oh gosh, if I was just a little bit meaner to myself, then I would pull through. And like, I'll be usually, unfortunately, they get to me when they've doubled down on that strategy for years and they're just having such a terrible time doing the basics even of the sport that they're participating in. And it's like, they've never even challenged that's their plan. It's been unconsciously running as the plan in the background without any kind of checks on it.
Yeah, kind of the definition of insanity. You just keep working on that and see if that helps you after a while.
Right.
But to that, so because you work with coaches, like coaches helping athletes and coaching coaches, what do you tell if you go to a club or to a team or whoever you're talking, and they're trying to figure out how to deal with their athletes? Like, I have this kid, like, are you helping them recognize that when maybe they don't have that background in positive psychology and they're like, I don't know what to do with this person over here. They're constantly have this thing where they're mad at their teammates or they're mad at themselves, they shut down or they freak out. Like, how are you teaching those coaches to do it? Because so many people, I think, for a long time when we talk about sports, those coaches have technique on lock. Right? Like they're good. They know how to make great athletes, but they may not have that mindset thing on. I just see it over and over again where they're like, I don't know what to do with them. They just keep freaking out. They're always crying in the bathroom, or, I'm like, there's no crying on a pool deck, or what? There's no crying in baseball. So when they're looking at like, I don't know what to do with them. How do you coach those coaches?
Well, so I think what you're talking about is, and one of the reasons why I've leaned so hard into coaching coaches, even though it's tough. I mean, I will admit it's hard. It's hard to get coaches into the mindset of even wanting to be coached. Like many of them psychologically have moved onto a space where they're like, well, no, I'm the coach now. Like nobody coaches me, which again, unchallenged. Once I start to challenge that, I don't get a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, like I was right. They sort of know intuitively on some level that
Right.
that's wrong, but that's where they are. So it is a big challenge to break in with a coaching audience. But this, to me, this is where all the opportunity is, because I think you're right. The average level, I'm not saying there are some people that are better than others. They have different skill sets, but I'm just saying your average coach, again, in the sport of swimming, the one that I came out of, I think is really good at teaching the technical aspects of the sport. They're really good at training. They have a lot of really good foundational ideas about training. When it comes to the psychological side of the sport, they don't know what they're doing. And yet many of them are finding themselves more and more being challenged in that department, because the culture has changed, the climate has changed. Kids are more open. Kids are more willing to talk about what's going on with them, right? And not suffer in silence or be scared to share that with the coach. And so a lot of the coaches I get in on the other end are like, man, I'm finding myself in a lot of conversations where I have no idea what to do.
This is uncomfortable.
And I'm uncomfortable, and I better, get some tools for figuring out what I'm doing. The other thing that I would say that clues into some of what I work on with coaches is a lot of it is based just around language and communication. One of the big things that I have noticed as there's been a broader discussion of mental health in sports is a lot of the language that has come in has been from the clinical world, from the therapy world. We had a conversation on my podcast about all the self-diagnosis piece of it. And I think that language is at best really, really clunky for coaches to use, because for the most part, we're not mental health professionals. We're not trained. And even if we were, I'm not sure it'd be appropriate for us to use it in a coaching environment. So positive psychology, just through the way that, through its sort of foundational concepts, it gives language for people to be able to discuss a lot of the same things, but without falling back on this sort of clinical, cold, for lack of a better term, even problem-based language. And I think that speaks to where coaches are, right? Because I was having a conversation with a coach about this yesterday that I'm going to be working with next year. All that language is from the traditional psychology or the clinical world it's from a rehabilitative model. And coaches, we don't do rehabilitation. Like the PTs do rehabilitation. We do training. Positive psychology is the language of training your mind. And so I try to give coaches a way to communicate to athletes about how to train your mind, how to build up your competencies, how to look at situations that you find yourself in and develop, new ways of thinking for approaching those so that you show up differently. And so a lot of it is built around that. And again, think again, just continuing to iterate on that, because there's truly no end point, right? Where you just go oh, well, we've found the perfect way to think about that. So, moving on, we don't have to do anything anymore, right? It's lovely in a certain way because it remains so open-ended and you can always continue to.
It's interesting once you start digging into, I didn't necessarily realize I was even thinking this, or I didn't realize how much that thought impacted either how I'm behaving or, my beliefs, whatever it is that it's impacting, that once we smooth one thing over, we're like, okay, I handled that, another one pops right up. I mean, it's always that process of there's going to be something, because life is going to happen. There's always going to be another situation where you're not ever going to get to the point where you have this perfectly manicured mind. It's going to be wild and crazy in there. And it is something that we just have to recognize, that our brains are going to go little off the rails sometimes, and that's okay. And, the whole diagnosis conversation aside, people's brains are brains are gonna brain. They're just gonna do their thing. And sometimes we just have to understand who we are so we can say, okay, back on track. That sometimes that happens. And I can still do all of these things that I need to focus on changing and working on. It's such it's such an interesting thing where when you have those coaches that spend so much of their training, yes, they're well trained and being able to help their athletes perform, that they don't. I think it's unfortunate that that we're just now coming into this place where like, but do you know how much your brain impacts your body and how much it affects those physical results? I had my swimmers last season sit down and we did a visualization. And so I had this sweet freshman come in, bless him. He was like true, like just coming into high school freshman, very young freshman. And so I said, all you have to do, let me explain this to you. You're just going to lay here with your eyes closed and listen to me talk. I'm like, that's all. And they're like, that's all I have to do. So afterwards, he sits up and he's kind of sleepy. And I was like, okay, that worked well for him. He's a little zoned out, which I loved. He goes, are you a witch? And I go, what? I go, no, why? He goes, did you just put a spell on us? And I'm like, no, I didn't. I was like, it's a meditation. Think of it, it's whatever you want to call it. It's a meditation. It's a prayer. It's a visualization. I'm explaining to them how when you practice it inside of your brain assumes it's true. I'm giving them all the things. So we get to our conference meet and these kids, I'm like, do you remember when we practiced this? I recorded this for you. Do you know? I'm like, what are you going to get in this race? And I had several kids they'd tell me their time and they'd get in and they're like, what'd you just do? And I'm like, what did I just do? I didn't do anything. I'm like, you nailed your time. Like within just a couple hundredths of a second. And they're like, I don't understand how that happened. I'm like, when you practice it, your brain makes it happen. I'm like, we just practiced it. And they were mystified. By the end of it, they're like, oh my gosh. So we got to the last meet of the season for this one kid who's a junior. And somebody's like, I just was out of breath. I couldn't quite do it. And this kid looks at him, he goes, oxygen is a mindset. And I'm like, too far. Like, yes, but no. I'm like, it's sinking in slowly. We're getting there. But he's like, oxygen is the mindset. Oxygen is the mindset. And I'm like, well, oxygen's not really a mindset. But
it is a necessity.
I'm like, we're trying so hard. But it's just so interesting. Like the things that if more coaches would incorporate those things. And so when you think about all the tools or all of the different thought processes, what is the one that if you go in and you're like, step one, this is where we start?
Well, so where I start always, and I built a whole coaching program for coaches. So this is an easy question for me to answer because
good, let's go.
People who've been through it, they know exactly what I'm going to say.
Yeah.
First, I start with motivation because where a lot of people want to engage with this kind of work is way, as far as I visualize it, on the other end of the spectrum, right? They're struggling with performance or they're having some issues around performance and they want to fix that. And for me, I think those issues usually that they're dealing with start all the way back to the way that you motivate yourself and the way that you actually build infrastructure around it. We talked about this earlier in terms of some of the dysfunctional things that people lean into. I think most people unconsciously, if they never think structurally about their motivation, they default to scaring the ever-living daylights out of themselves to get themselves to do things, right? They tell themselves some kind of version of I have like an improv routine where I go out and the first time I'm talking and I'll go to a group of athletes and go, okay, where's a moment where you, especially swimming athletes, where you struggle with your motivation? And some kid inevitably, what do they answer? Oh, morning practice. I woke up, I got to go to, it's the crack of dawn. It's cold outside. I got to go over to the pool. I go, great. Okay. What do you tell yourself to get yourself over there? And inevitably 9 out of 10 kids will go, well, tell myself I have to go or I'm not going to swim fast or I'm not going to achieve. And I'm like, okay.
Yuck.
Now, what people don't realize and what I try to teach them in terms of motivation is when you just press that motivational button over and over and over again, you are literally training your own pessimism. You're telling yourself over and over again, if you're not perfect, you will fail. Okay. And then you wonder why I'm showing up to a competition and I've like worked my butt off for 6 months. And yet my attitude is like, oh, I hope I do okay. Oh my God, what if I don't do okay? Like, what's wrong? Like, that's what you trained up. That's what you developed. Right. And we instinctually go to that because that fear gets you, no doubt. Okay. If you just look at a little local situation, fear gets you from point A to point B. Okay. We'll all get our blood pumping if a wild animal's chasing us and we think, we got to survive. That fear will get you, but it does not care about the long term. And it doesn't build long-term infrastructure for motivation. And for most people, it's not true. That's not really what you think. On some level, you understand that you want to get up in the morning and go over and train because you think it's going to give you a better chance to do well. But that second one is not as immediately available. And it takes a little bit more patience and development and long-term thinking and even like sort of multi-step thinking, right? That's not just A to B. Thinking around, okay, this is how I'm going to set up motivating myself to do things now. And that will contribute to me 6 months from now showing up differently when it's actually time for me to perform and compete. So motivation, and I call it motivational infrastructure, is always where I start.
Yeah, I love that. I just had that conversation with a kid the other day about practice, specifically going to practice. And I'm like, all right, what are you looking forward to? Well, I mean, I know I got to go. So I guess I'll go work my hardest. And I was like, whoa, that doesn't sound fun at all. And so I had a conversation, this was a couple of years ago, with this little girl I was coaching. She was pretty young and her dream, so she swam for Carmel. And I'm coaching her, and her mom sent her to me because she was so anxious. So previously I coached on anxiety specifically. I get this little girl who's anxious behind the blocks. So again, performance anxiety or whatever. And I was like, hey, what is it that what's your goal? And her goal, she's swimming in the same club and she's swimming with Alex Shackle, right? Alex is just fast.
Olympian, just for anybody who's listening who doesn't know.
Okay, first of all, she's 5 years older than you. And second of all, it's Alex Shackle. Come on. So I was like, well, what's the problem? And she goes, well, how am I going to be as fast as her? And I was like, she's an anomaly. But I said, well, have you ever asked her how she got so fast? And she said, no, I've never talked to her. And I was like, well, this week you're going to go ask her how you got fast. So I was like, how are you going to do that? She said, I'll have to take my friends with me. I said, fine, take your friends. So they all gather up after practice. They run over, and this little girl mustered up the courage to ask her about how did you get so fast? And she said, oh, it's easy. Every day before practice, I come in and I pick on Coach John, and then we joke around for a long time before practice. And she said, it's really fun. And so this little girl comes back to me and I said, well, what'd you learn? She said she picks on Coach John and that it's fun. And I said, so what if that's the right answer? She said, well, which part? I go, what if it's just supposed to be fun? What if the whole thing is it has to be fun? So this kid who I'm talking to yesterday, I'm like, when you come back next week, your job, you have to find something that's fun. Because right now you are a giant, you're just a cluster of red flags for burnout. You're going to be burnout. You're not going to get that nationals cut because you're just muscling your way through. And so to your point, motivation, and for me, my first step is always what is fun about this? And if your answer is, I just want to be fast, I'm like, oof, it's going to be a rough road.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I find myself thinking about it all the time, even in my adult life. I still compete in swimming. I do master swimming.
Yeah.
I have swum a lifetime best. I'm 42 years old. I swam a lifetime best in the last 12 months.
That's amazing. I love that.
Yeah. And I'm a dad and I'm a husband and I'm running my own business. I got other shit going on. I don't know if we're allowed to swear on this podcast.
You can cuss, it was A-okay.
Okay. I got other shit going on. But I don't struggle to go to the pool because when I go to the pool, I know exactly why I'm there. And it's not to go best time. That's something that happens. And I want that to happen. But I am at the pool because I think it makes me better at everything else that I care about. And it has a positive impact on everything else that I care about. And so why wouldn't I go? Right? Like it's almost like you'd have to talk me out of going. And that's a difference. I mean, I wasn't always that way, right? I definitely had a moment in my own athletic career where I was like, oh, I have to go to practice and what a drag.
Yeah.
And, so that's a step in a progression for a lot of people. And again, that's where I sort of come back to it with coaches is like, understand that the way people are showing up psychologically, that's something that they have learned to do. It's like a bad technique, right? It's in the same way you said earlier. Oh, you said on my podcast, you're talking about muscle memory. It's a mind. It's gotten grooved in, to the gray matter to think along certain lines. And you can be frustrated about that for sure. But the good news is they can groove in a different way of thinking. Like it is possible. The mind is flexible. There's neuroplasticity, and we can train a different thought process around all this stuff, and their approach will change. And if you look at it like that, right, as a trainable skill, just like you would a freestyle, a turn, a start, any other skill part of the sport, then you have a chance to change directions on that. I think the biggest part where, I know that unfortunately this is the way I was treated in a lot of instances as an athlete. When I started to struggle psychologically, I had a series of coaches that were like, this guy's just a head case. That's what they used to say back then, right?
Right.
This guy's a head case. And that was like sort of a coach way of being like, it's not my responsibility
What's to do with
try to
that?
do anything about this. That's just his problem, or that's just, how he is. And I just couldn't disagree more, right? I firmly reject that. And I'm trying to get out there in the world and help other people, to help kids like me, help, the next generation of athletes write a different story about what it's like to do the sport.
Yeah. I feel like you just answered my last question. Like, if you could tell anybody, like, this is what you need to know about positive psychology, whether it's in sports or business, I think that idea that, we're all in our heads. So I guess technically, does that make us all a head case? Like, what would you want them to know? Like, what's the thing that you're like, look, this is the biggest deal that you need to know? Is it that?
I think the biggest deal and the revelation, I will say, to me about positive psychology, where I hooked into it in the first place, I was coaching at Penn, right? And this was when they started the program, first of its kind in the United States. Martin Seligman, who's a psychologist out of University of Pennsylvania, has written some big psychology books, founded the program. And he had written a book that I read before I started called Learned Optimism. Now, I tell people this story all the time. Martin Seligman had 30 years prior to developing a theory of learned optimism, had been responsible for something that I think has come into more popular usage now, learned helplessness, right? He had figured out, like, you can learn to lose all hope and think like there's nothing I can do. This is a, helpless situation. So I might as well just not try. But if that's true, then people can also learn the other side, right, of that coin. People can learn to be hopeful. People can learn to be optimistic. And to me, it's just an example of what positive psychology tends to focus on is the fact that there's all these things that in other contexts we might start to think of as fixed traits. Like that's just, they're just a really positive person. I don't agree. I think that you can learn to do those things. The most recent one that I have really been iterating a lot on is because I realize I used to think that this was just a trait of how people were. I used to think that, kindness was just a trait of how people are. I don't believe that anymore. I think kindness is something that you can develop, and it changed the way that I viewed people in my life where I go, that person's really kind. I think sometimes we like deny all the work that went into that by being like, oh, they're just, that's just how they are. No. It takes work within you to develop that stuff. And it's possible to change so much, just in the same way you go in the weight room and you do some bicep curls and you get, muscle hypertrophy and the muscles get bigger. The same is possible in your mind. You can train things and you can develop things and you can really, really grow into something completely different than where you were at a different stage of your life.
That is a world-changing thought. I love that. Yeah. That's the goal for everybody listening to this podcast, is to go change your mind. We have to do it. But the idea that we can choose kindness and change how we react and who we are and all of that, that's the good stuff. That's what we want. I mean, whether it's athletes or anybody else, I think that the goal of coaching is to make everybody a better human for themselves, but for everybody too. So, oh my goodness. Okay. How do people find you and connect with you, and what kind of goodies do you have to offer them?
So, as we referenced earlier, my podcast is called the Swim Brief Podcast. If you want to listen to interviews like the one I did with Megan, it's really, really good. So you guys should go and do that. But I interview all sorts of other people from the swimming world, sports psychologists. Basically, the podcast is like anybody that I get really curious about and I want to learn. I get them on there and I steal all their knowledge from them. You didn't know you were part of my devious plot, but the Swim Brief Podcast.
We all have plots.
Yes. If you want to email me, I'll give out my real personal email address, crdesantis@gmail.com, DESANTIS. You can go to my website, chrisdcoach.com. There's a contact form there you can fill out and send to me. And finally, you can find me on Instagram, chrisd_coach as well. And if you go there, you'll find clips of the podcast and occasionally, other random things, but mostly clips of the podcast.
Let's do it. Go find him, say hello, check out his podcast, and make sure that you come back here for more. There's always more shorts, more clips, and more information. So you can watch this on YouTube. You can find it on any of the podcast platforms, and you definitely want to check out Chris's podcast as well. So thank you for listening and for joining us, and I will be back again.
Thank you.